If you've ever driven Highway 3 through the Crow's Nest Pass, you've seen the GMD plant's most extraordinary creation. A dump truck 3 stories tall, sitting engineless beside the road in Sparwood, British Columbia. So large it barely registers as something a person could have built. Behind that single machine was a 208-acre factory in London, Ontario, whose union workforce built diesel locomotives for railways across 40 countries. They survived the end of the steam age, survived losing their bus lines and their earth mover division, survived the border opening under free trade, and came out the sole locomotive builder for all of North America. And then, after 62 years of continuous production in London, the plant went silent. How does a factory that built the biggest truck on Earth and every locomotive on the continent simply disappear? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The Factory on the Outskirts. The story begins with a wall. Not a physical wall, a tariff wall. In the late 1940s, Canada's import duties on American-built locomotives were steep enough that General Motors couldn't simply ship units across the border from Illinois and expect to compete. If GM wanted to sell diesel locomotives to Canadian railways, it would have to build them in Canada. It was a simple calculation. And in September of 1949, construction crews broke ground on open farmland east of London, Ontario, a mid-sized city in the agricultural heartland of southwestern Ontario, roughly 200 kilometers from the American border. The site would eventually sprawl across 208 acres. The plan was straightforward. 1 locomotive per day, assembled by Canadian hands, sold to Canadian railways, making the urgent leap from steam to diesel power. What's worth knowing is that GM was late. Montreal Locomotive Works, the Canadian subsidiary of the American Locomotive Company, had been operating since 1901. The Canadian Locomotive Company in Kingston had been turning out engines since the 19th century. Both had deep roots, established workforces, generations of institutional knowledge. GM had none of that. It had never built a steam locomotive. It couldn't repurpose an existing shop or inherit a trained workforce. Everything on Oxford Street East, every building, every rail spur, every production line, had to be built from nothing on flat southwestern Ontario farmland. And yet this was GM's advantage. The company wasn't converting from steam. It was starting clean, building a factory purpose-designed for diesel-electric locomotive assembly at a moment when every railway in the country was desperate to modernize. The timing was almost too perfect. Canadian National and Canadian Pacific were placing orders faster than any builder could fill them. The age of steam was ending, and the age of diesel had an empty factory waiting for it on the outskirts of London. The first locomotive rolled out on August 25, 1950. Chapter 2. Diesel Country. Her name, if a locomotive earns one, was TH&B number 71. A GP7 road switcher built for the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railway, a small line serving the corridor between Hamilton and the American border at Buffalo, New York. She cost $191,712, less than a modest house in London would cost 70 years later. She wasn't the first order the plant received. That distinction belonged to Canadian Pacific. 10 FP7A cab units, the classic covered wagon style with the bulldog nose that would define the look of Canadian diesel power for a generation. But TH&B 71 was the first locomotive completed, the plant's firstborn. Both orders were on the shop floor simultaneously. A brand new factory, weeks into operation, running 2 contracts at once. The production floor found its rhythm quickly. Locomotive frames sat on rails within the plant itself, moving through assembly stations where components were bolted together in sequence. The engines arrived by rail from EMD's facility in LaGrange, Illinois. The beating hearts of the operation. 16-cylinder 2-stroke diesels unlike anything else in industrial machinery. Traction motors, generators, electrical cabinets dense with wiring. And at the end of the line, fresh paint in EMD's distinctive scheme, and the moment every worker on the floor could hear. A completed locomotive starting up for the first time. The deep, thrumming idle of an EMD 567 series engine. A sound that vibrated through the concrete floor and announced that something heavy and purposeful had just come to life. The orders kept coming: GP7s and GP9s for branch lines, SD40s, and the iconic SD42 for mainline freight, FP7s and FP9s for passenger service. The London plant built EMD's full North American catalog for Canadian railways, and then went further. The GMD-1, a light road switcher designed specifically for Canadian branch lines too fragile for standard road power, had no direct American equivalent. Canada's geography, the thin branch lines stretching into the prairies, the northern resource railways, the seasonal grain routes, demanded machines that EMD's Lagrange engineers hadn't conceived. So London conceived them. Canadian geography shaping Canadian-built machines for Canadian conditions. By the mid-1950s, the steam-to-diesel conversion was in full acceleration. CN and CP were ordering heavily, and the export business was growing alongside them. GMD built locomotives for railways in more than 40 countries, supported by Canadian government export grants that made the London plant a global supplier. The factory that tariffs had forced into existence was now shipping diesel power across the world. And that first locomotive, TH&B number 71, the $191,000 machine, was already a relic of scale. The plant that built her was about to become something no one had planned for. Because locomotives, it turned out, weren't going to be enough to fill that 208-acre site. And GM had other ideas for the factory floor in London. Chapter 3. More than trains. By the early 1960s, the initial rush of steam-to-diesel conversion was slowing. The major railways had placed their orders. The backlog was thinning. And a 208-acre factory with a skilled, unionized workforce, Canadian Auto Workers. Local 27, welders and electricians and machinists, had capacity to spare. GM filled it. Starting in 1961, the London plant began assembling transit buses. The General Motors New Look model, the flat-faced, rear-engine city bus that would define North American public transit for the next 3 decades. If you rode a bus in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, or any major Canadian city between the 1960s and the 1990s, the odds are strong it was built in London. Thousands of them. The same workers, the same production site, a different machine rolling out the doors. But buses were only the beginning. The real transformation started with an antitrust order from the United States Department of Justice and a family of 5 brothers from Ohio. In 1933, the Armington brothers, George, Arthur, Stuart, Everett, and Ray, incorporated the Euclid Road Machinery Company. The family had been in the business since 1907, when George Armington founded the Armington Electric Hoist Company, and they'd grown Euclid into the dominant force in off-highway dump trucks. By the early 1950s, Euclid controlled more than half the American market for the massive haulers used in mining, dam building, and highway construction. In 1953, General Motors bought Euclid outright. George Armington, who'd built the company from nothing, lived to see it absorbed into the world's largest corporation. He died the following year, at 89. His youngest son, Ray, was the last Armington to work under GM ownership. He stayed on as general manager of the Euclid division for 7 years before retiring in 1960. By then, the family's creation had become a piece of something vastly larger, and the U.S. government had noticed. In 1959, the Department of Justice filed an antitrust suit against GM for monopolizing the off-highway truck market. The case ground forward for nearly a decade. When the ruling finally came in 1968, it forced GM to divest the Euclid brand entirely: the name, the logo, the pre-acquisition product lines. All of it sold to White Motor Corporation. But here was the twist. GM got to keep everything Euclid had developed under GM ownership. Every new truck design, every crawler, every front-end loader, every scraper. The old Euclid was gone, but the new machines, bigger, more powerful, built with GM's resources, needed a name. They called it Terex. From the Latin, terra, earth, and rex, king, king of the earth. And the biggest Terex machines, the electric drive haulers designed for the deepest open pit mines on the planet, were built at the GMD plant in London, Ontario. The logic was elegant and inescapable. These trucks ran on diesel-electric drivetrains, a diesel engine driving an electrical generator powering traction motors at the wheels. It was exactly the same technology that powered every locomotive the London plant had ever built. The same engines, the same generators, the same traction motors, locomotives for rails, trucks for mines. The factory didn't need to learn new skills. It already had them. A worker from Blackwood Hodge, the Terex dealer network, visited the London production floor multiple times in those years, and later recalled that the GM locomotive engines were a production item at the London plant, and the Terex trucks were a natural fit to be built on the same lines where other Terex products, smaller off-road trucks and front-end loaders, were already being assembled. By the late 1960s, the site on Oxford Street East was something extraordinary. Locomotives in various stages of assembly, alongside bus chassis, alongside the massive frames of Terex haulers. 3 entirely different machines, trains, buses, and the biggest dump trucks on the planet, rolling off the same Canadian production floor, built by the same union workforce. CAW Local 27 members. Skilled tradespeople whose hands could build anything diesel-powered. The same factory that built the locomotive pulling your freight train also built the bus you rode to work, and the dump truck digging the mine that supplied the steel for both. And then, in the early 1970s, GM gave the London factory its most extraordinary assignment. Chapter 4. The Titan. The problem was ore quality. Across the mining world, the richest, most accessible deposits were being exhausted. What remained, the tar sands of northern Alberta, the deep coal seams of British Columbia, the diminishing iron ore of the American Southwest, required moving staggering volumes of earth to reach. The mines were getting deeper, the haul roads were getting longer, and the economics demanded trucks that could carry more earth per trip than anything ever built. GM's answer was the Terex 3319. The workers in London who assembled it called it what everyone else would call it, the Titan. It was assembled at the GMD plant in London, Ontario, in 1973. Only one was ever built, a prototype, and at the moment of its completion, it was the largest, highest-capacity haul truck in human history. The numbers tell a story that words strain to match. 350 short tons of payload capacity, an empty weight of 255 tons, before you put a single rock in the box. Loaded, the Titan tipped the scales at over 600 tons. 66 feet 9 inches long, longer than a city bus. 22 feet 7 inches tall at rest, which is roughly 3 stories. With the dump body raised, 56 feet, over 5 stories of Canadian-built steel rising into the sky. The engine was an EMD 16645E4, 16 cylinders, turbocharged and intercooled. A locomotive engine, the same family of power plant the workers on that production floor bolted into train chassis every working day. Its displacement was 10,343 cubic inches. That's 170 liters. A family car engine displaces roughly 2 liters. The Titan's single engine was the equivalent of 85 car engines combined into one block. At 900 RPM, it produced 3,300 horsepower and generated enough electricity to power 3,200 homes. It consumed 265 liters of diesel per hour, 70 gallons, from a fuel tank that held 800 gallons. And it drove the same diesel-electric transmission the plant used in its locomotives. The engine spun an AC alternator, which supplied rectified current to 4 GM traction motors housed in the rear axle. Locomotive technology transferred whole into a truck chassis. The workers who built it weren't learning something new. They were applying what they already knew at a scale no one had attempted. The Titan had to be broken into sections and loaded onto rail flat cars to be shipped to its first job site. It couldn't travel by road. There's an irony in that, a truck riding a train, and both built in the same factory by the same hands. In October of 1974, the Titan was shown to the public for the first time at the American Mining Congress in Las Vegas. 3 years later, it became a television star. On September 22, 1977, the Titan appeared in a Terex commercial alongside Jack Nicklaus, the Golden Bear, 37 years old, and arguably the most famous athlete in America. The commercial opened with Nicholas standing in the loaded bed of the Titan, hitting golf balls out of a box filled with sand to mimic a bunker. It aired during major televised sporting events through 1977 and 78. A worker from the London area remembered it decades later. Nicholas, the sand, the impossible scale of the truck behind him. Jack Nicholas, standing in the bed of a machine built by union workers in London, Ontario, hitting golf balls on national television. The truck was the star. The Blackwood Hodge employee who'd visited the production line during assembly later recalled having a large photograph of the completed Titan, signed by most of the people involved in building it. Those signatures, the names of CAW Local 27 members who assembled the largest truck on Earth, were the factory's quiet claim on history. The Titan held the world record for 25 years. No one built anything bigger until the Caterpillar 797 in 1998, and only one was ever made. The world's largest truck was a Canadian one-of-a-kind, assembled by workers whose day job was building locomotives, powered by an engine they could have pulled from inventory. The Titan would work for 13 years, hauling earth in the mines of California and British Columbia, carrying approximately 3.5 million tons of rock despite chronic mechanical problems that came from being the only one of its kind in existence. No spare parts catalog, no sister trucks to cannibalize. Every repair was bespoke. But the factory that built it was about to lose something it couldn't get back. Chapter 5. Losing Ground. The Terex earth mover business was the first thing to go. Through the late 1970s, a global recession hammered the construction equipment market. Demand for the massive haulers collapsed alongside the commodity prices that justified digging the mines they served. And GM, increasingly focused on its automotive business, decided it didn't want to be in the earth-moving business anymore. On January 1, 1981, GM sold the entire Terex division to IBH Holding AG, a German conglomerate led by a businessman named Horst Dieter Esch. The deal was supposed to give Terex the independence and investment it needed to compete against Caterpillar and Komatsu in the global equipment market. It didn't. Within 2 years, IBH Holdings filed for bankruptcy. Ownership of Terex reverted to GM, but the damage was done. Earth mover production at the London plant had already wound down. The enormous hauler frames, the Terex green paint, the mine-bound trucks rolling out alongside locomotives and buses, all of it was gone from Oxford Street East. What happened next to the Terex name is a story that belongs to a man named Randolph W. Lenz. An ex-Marine with a psychology degree, Lenz specialized in buying distressed industrial companies at prices that defied belief. In 1983, he purchased Northwest Engineering, the corporate vehicle he'd later use to acquire the Terex brand, for $1,200. $1,200. Less than a used car. Over the following years, Lenz assembled the pieces GM had discarded, buying up Terex product lines and eventually building what would become the independent Terex Corporation. The name that was born from a U.S. antitrust order that meant King of the Earth in schoolboy Latin, that had once graced the largest truck ever built. It left GM's hands entirely, acquired by a man whose entry ticket cost less than a month's rent. The buses went too. By the late 1980s, transit bus production had left London. The factory that had built 3 different products for 3 different industries was narrowing back to its original purpose. Locomotives. 1 product line, 1 customer base, 1 reason for being. And even that core business was shifting beneath the plant's feet. In 1989, General Electric overtook EMD as the leading North American locomotive builder. After decades of dominance, decades in which an EMD engine in a GMD-built body was the default freight locomotive on every Class 1 railway in the country, London's parent division was now number 2. The gap would only widen. But here's the turn that nobody expected. The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement, signed in 1988 by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, lowered the tariff wall that had created the London plant in the first place. And instead of killing the factory, it saved it, at least for a while. With the border open, there was less reason for GM to maintain separate locomotive assembly operations in the United States and Canada. In 1989, GM centralized all North American locomotive production at London, closing final assembly at the original LaGrange, Illinois facility. London became EMD's sole locomotive assembly plant for the entire continent. The factory that Canadian tariffs had forced into existence was now sustained by free trade. It was building every locomotive EMD sold in North America, for Canadian railways, for American railways, for export customers on 6 continents. The irony cut both ways. Centralization meant London got everything. It also meant London was now a single point of failure. One plant, one product, one corporate parent. Every locomotive order in North America flowed through Oxford Street East. If that flow ever stopped, there was nothing else. For 15 years, London built every locomotive EMD sold in North America. Then GM decided it didn't want to be in the locomotive business anymore. Chapter 6. Sold. The first sale happened on April 4, 2005. General Motors, staggering toward the bankruptcy it would file in 2009, divested the entire electromotive diesel subsidiary, including the London, Ontario plant, to a pair of private equity firms, Greenbrier Equity Group and Berkshire Partners. The company was renamed Electromotive Diesel, Incorporated. The Canadian operation became Electromotive Canada. The 465 production workers in London, the welders, electricians, and machinists of TOW Local 27, were now employed by private equity. The connection to one of the world's largest corporations, the institutional anchor that had sustained the plant for 55 years, was severed. EMD still had revenues of $1.8 billion and exported locomotives to more than 70 countries. But the ownership had changed from a company that built things to firms whose business was buying and selling companies. The distinction matters. The second sale came 5 years later. In June of 2010, Caterpillar's subsidiary Progress Rail Services signed a definitive agreement to purchase EMD for $820 million. Caterpillar's vice chairman and CEO-elect, Doug Oberhelman, called the acquisition a natural fit, a way to aggressively grow Caterpillar's rail and energy business. The deal was reviewed under Canada's Investment Canada Act, which requires foreign takeovers to demonstrate a net benefit to the country. The Harper government approved it. The terms were never publicly disclosed. The TAW asked for transparency. None came. 5 months after the acquisition closed, in October of 2010, Caterpillar announced development of a new locomotive assembly plant in Muncie, Indiana. The stated reason: Buy America provisions required locomotives for publicly funded U.S. rail systems to be assembled on American soil. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also, in hindsight, a signal. And there was this. On March 19, 2008, 2 years before the Caterpillar acquisition, Prime Minister Stephen Harper had personally visited the electromotive plant in London. He wrote a locomotive for the cameras. He announced $5 million in federal tax breaks for the company. He called Ontario the engine of the Canadian economy. Less than 2 years after Harper's visit, the plant was sold to Caterpillar. Less than 4 years after, it would be closed. The collective agreement between Electromotive Canada and CAW Local 27 expired on December 31, 2011. Caterpillar's final offer to the workers landed like a demolition charge. A 55% wage cut, from $35 an hour to approximately $16.50. Elimination of the defined pension plan. Gutted healthcare coverage. Reduced overtime rates. 4 paid holidays eliminated. Vacation time cut. KOW negotiator Bob Orr described it plainly. They issued an ultimatum, he said. He wouldn't call it bargaining. Caterpillar reportedly told the union it had never been able to attain that level of concessions anywhere in the world. The workers voted overwhelmingly to reject the offer and authorize strike action. On January 1, 2012, New Year's Day, Caterpillar locked out 465 production workers. The picket lines went up in a London winter. Workers in parkas and toques on the sidewalk outside the plant gates. Behind them, the factory fell quiet. And on the frozen ground beside the line, they built what they called a job cemetery. Wooden crosses bearing names and dates of service. Years, decades, entire working lives planted in the snow like headstones. On January 21st, an estimated 5 to 15,000 union and community members rallied in Victoria Park in downtown London. Buses came from Sudbury, from Timmins, from Ottawa. The Sisters of St. Joseph served soup on the picket line. Occupy London was there. Organizers called it the largest demonstration in the city's history. Worker Brad Buford told reporters the company's offer was a huge slap in the face. He said he had never encountered something as arrogant as that in his life. 5 days later, on January 26th, Caterpillar reported its financial results for 2011. Record high sales. A profit of nearly $5 billion, up 83% from the previous year. The most profitable year in the corporation's history. $4.9 billion in profit. And a demand that its London workers accept $16.50 an hour. NDP interim leader Nicole Turmel noted that Harper had come to the plant for a photo op, and now he wasn't there. "He's hiding," she said. Harper's office responded with a single line. "This matter falls under provincial jurisdiction." Chapter 7. The Silence. On February 3, 2012, Progress Rail issued a press release from Peoria, Illinois. The cost structure of the operation was not sustainable, it read, and efforts to negotiate a new, competitive collective agreement were not successful. The London plant would close permanently. Production would move to Muncie, Indiana, and other facilities in the United States and Latin America. 62 years of continuous production. Locomotives for 40 countries. Transit buses for every major Canadian city. The largest truck ever built. Ended in a corporate press release. The 465 production workers were out. Scores of office and management staff followed. An estimated 2,000 additional workers in the London area, component suppliers, logistics operators, support services, felt the impact directly. COW President Ken Lowenza said the union would focus on negotiating a severance package. He mentioned the possibility of a plant occupation. The COW had occupied a closing Caterpillar plant in Brampton in 1991 to force better severance terms. But the occupation never came. The workers voted to accept a severance deal. The picket lines stayed up for one reason. 9 nearly completed locomotives sat inside the plant. The workers refused to let Caterpillar remove them, or any machinery, until the severance terms were settled. The last things built in that factory were held hostage by the people who built them. Worker Jay McIntosh, with nearly 5 years at the plant, told reporters the KW had provided no information about closure negotiations. The silence from above was its own kind of answer. London's closure was the third major factory shutdown in southwestern Ontario in 6 months. Navistar closed its heavy truck plant in Chatham in 2011. Ford closed its assembly plant in St. Thomas, Talbotville, just south of London, in September of the same year. Now Caterpillar. The manufacturing heartland of southwestern Ontario was being hollowed out in real time. London's unemployment rate sat at 7.7%, above the national average. 3 years later, in 2015, the last remnant disappeared. The remaining electromotive diesel office in London, 50 workers, locomotive testers, design engineers, production planners who had survived the 2012 shutdown, received layoff notices. The final 50. The last people in London, Ontario, who knew how to build a locomotive. EMD's presence in Canada was over. Chapter 8. What the Titan remembers. The 208-acre site on Oxford Street East still stands. HCL Logistics, a defense sector company, moved into the old plant buildings. General Dynamics Land Systems, which had acquired GM's adjacent military vehicle operation back in 2003, continues to employ roughly 1,800 workers in armored vehicle design and manufacturing on the same compound. The military side of the old GM campus survived. The locomotive side did not. No locomotives have been built in London, Ontario since 2012. EMD's remaining production is in Muncie, Indiana, and what's left of the Lagrange operation. The London plant, the factory that Canadian tariffs created, that free trade consolidated, that once built every locomotive EMD sold in North America, ironically outlived the original Lagrange facility. And then it was killed by the same corporation's successor anyway. The 465 production workers scattered into a southwestern Ontario economy that had less and less room for the skills they carried. Welders, electricians, machinists, people who could assemble a diesel-electric locomotive from the frame up, people who had built the biggest truck on Earth. Their expertise had no factory left to receive it. And the Titan. The Titan worked at Kaiser Steel's Eagle Mountain iron mine in California from January of 1975, hauling approximately 3.5 million tons of earth over 4 years, despite constant downtime. The curse of being one of a kind. No parts catalog. No sister units. Every breakdown a custom repair. In late 1978, it was shipped by rail to Kaiser Steel's coal mine at Sparwood, British Columbia. When Westar Mining acquired the mine in 1983, they repainted the Titan from Terex lime green to Westar's blue and yellow, and purchased it outright from GM for $200,000 plus $1 million in spare parts. A machine that had cost roughly $1.5 million to build in 1976, $6.4 million in today's money, sold for a fraction of its value to keep it running a few more years in the mountains. It was fully retired in 1991. Too expensive to maintain. Too singular to supply. The economics that apply to a fleet of machines don't apply to the only one ever made. In 1993, the Titan nearly disappeared entirely. Teck Corporation, which had acquired the Sparwood mine, had no use for an engineless, obsolete prototype truck. It was headed for the scrapyard, 350 tons of Canadian-built steel destined to be cut apart for salvage. It was the people of Sparwood who saved it. Elkview Coal Corporation donated resources. Citizen volunteers organized the disassembly and relocation. A coal mining town in the BC interior, a community that had nothing to do with building the Titan, is the one that kept it alive. Today, the Titan sits on static display in Titan Park, just off Highway 3 in Sparwood, British Columbia. The engine has been removed. The Terex green is long gone, replaced and faded again. An informational plaque tells visitors what they're looking at. Tourists pull off the highway to stand beside it, to take photographs next to a machine so large it barely registers as something a person could have built. It cannot move. It cannot work. But it is there. The last physical proof that a factory in London, Ontario, built the biggest machine on Earth. The factory is silent. The workers signed a photograph once, the day the Titan was finished. Their names on the image of something impossible they'd made with their own hands. The plant that Harper visited for a photo op and $5 million in tax breaks is a logistics warehouse. The picket line where the Sisters of St. Joseph served soup is a memory held by people who were there and no one else. The 9 locomotives that sat unfinished behind the locked gates were eventually shipped out, completed somewhere else, by other hands. Canada built it. The workers signed it. The company sold it. The mine wore it out. The volunteers saved it. The factory is silent. The Titan remains.